Let me tell you about someone who shouldn't have lived past 1915. July 1916. The Somme. There's a battle happening that will kill more than 1 million men before it ends. The deadliest day in human warfare history is about to occur. And in the middle of this absolute nightmare, there's a 36-year-old British officer with a black eye patch and an empty sleeve commanding what's left of a battalion that started the morning with 1,000 men. By evening, 600 are dead. But here's the thing. This man, Adrian Carton de Wiart, just received the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire. When the king himself handed him this medal, when everyone in the room expected gratitude or humility, Adrian looked at him and said something that made grown generals go silent. He said, "Frankly, Your Majesty, I enjoyed the war." Think about that for a second. The man just came back from commanding in the worst battle in human history. He's watched kids, barely old enough to shave, get torn apart by machine gun fire. He's seen things that would shatter the human mind. And he tells the king that he enjoyed it. Enjoyed it. That's not normal. That's not psychology. That's something different entirely. That's a human being wired completely wrong, in a way that would make him either into a monster or into something the world had never really seen before. And Adrian Carton de Wiart was neither. He was something else. He was proof that the human spirit could withstand almost anything if you stopped being afraid of death. This is the story of a man who lived through 3 wars. The Boer War, World War I, World War II. He started as a young aristocrat who lied about his age to get into the first one, and he ended up as a general commanding armies. In between, he lost an eye, he lost his arm, he crashed out of planes twice. He was a prisoner of war, he escaped multiple times. Doctors told him after his first injury that he'd never fight again. He went back and fought for another 50 years. The thing about Adrian de Wiart is that he wasn't some mythical superhero. He wasn't blessed with extraordinary luck or magical healing powers or any of that nonsense. He was a regular man with an absolutely broken relationship with fear. And when you break down the psychology of what made him tick, when you actually look at how his brain was wired differently, you start to understand something crucial about human potential that most people never even consider. But before we get to all that, before we talk about what made him different, before we figure out how a man with one eye and one arm managed to command respect from warriors and kings alike, we need to go back to where it all started. Because understanding Adrian Carton de Wiart means understanding that he wasn't born this way. He became this way. He chose this way. And that choice, that decision he made when he was just a kid, that's what changed everything. So here's where we start. Brussels, 1880. The year is closing out. There's a baby being born into one of Europe's most prominent aristocratic families. His name is Adrian, and his father has already made plans for his entire life. Those plans involve a law degree from Oxford University. They involve a respectable career. They involve staying alive through the peaceful parts of history. They involve not dying on a battlefield somewhere in Africa or Asia or Europe. They involve being sensible, being safe, being what fathers in his position had always hoped their sons would become. And Adrian spent exactly 18 years respecting those plans. He went to Oxford. He studied the law. He was becoming exactly what his father wanted him to become. But then something happened in 1899 that changed everything. A war started in South Africa, the Boer War. British soldiers were fighting Dutch settlers who'd built a country there hundreds of years ago. It wasn't Adrian's war. He wasn't even British. He was born in Belgium, technically speaking. And honestly, it wasn't really his problem. He could have ignored it, could have finished his law degree, could have become exactly the person his father envisioned. Instead, Adrian did something that seems insane when you really think about it. He lied about his age. He forged documents claiming he was old enough. He joined the British Army under a fake name. He called himself Trooper Carton, so nobody would ask too many questions. And he went to Africa to fight in a war that had nothing to do with him, against people he'd never met, for reasons that honestly don't matter much now. He just went. Because something inside him recognized that sitting in an Oxford classroom while history was being written somewhere else wasn't actually living. That was just existing. That was just waiting for your real life to start. That's the moment where everything changed. That's where Adrian Carton de Wiart stopped being the son his father wanted him to be and started becoming something completely different. He became a fighter. He became someone who understood, at 18 years old, that death was going to come for him either way. Either it would find him in a battlefield, or it would find him in an old man's chair, having never actually been alive. And he made a choice. He chose the battlefield. He chose the risk. He chose to feel something real instead of being safe and numb. The Boer War lasted 4 years. From 1899 to 1903, Adrian fought in over 100 battles. He got wounded multiple times. He learned how to survive, when survival meant figuring out where the next bullet was coming from and making sure it wasn't heading for your head. He learned how to keep moving when every part of your body was screaming at you to stop. He learned that war, the thing that terrified normal people, the thing that kept decent men awake at night. War was the only place where he felt like he was actually alive. But here's where the story gets interesting, because after the Boer War ended, after Adrian came home as a decorated officer, as someone with medals and respect and a future in the British Army, something unexpected happened. He became depressed. Profoundly, deeply depressed. Because the war was over, and he was back in a world where nothing mattered. Back in a world where everything was safe and boring and didn't require you to be brave or strong or willing to die. He couldn't sleep properly. He couldn't focus. He couldn't find a single thing in civilian life that interested him the way combat had interested him. He would walk through London and feel like a ghost, like he was alive in a technical sense, but dead in every way that actually mattered. His fellow officers noticed. His family noticed. They all thought something was wrong with him, something broken. And they were right, but not in the way they thought. There wasn't anything wrong with Adrian. There was something wrong with the world around him. A world that had decided that the most important things were safety and comfort and stability and certainty. Adrian couldn't care about any of that. He'd already experienced something that made all those things seem like lies. He'd felt what it was like to be really, truly alive, and nothing else compared. He waited, and he waited, and he waited some more. Because he knew that wars don't end permanently. They just take breaks. They pause for a while, and then they start again. And he was right. In 1914, on a summer day in June, in a city called Sarajevo, an archduke was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb. That assassination set off a chain reaction that pulled every major European power into conflict. World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars, as people would eventually call it. Though it wouldn't be. It never really was. But Adrian didn't think about any of that. All he thought about was one thing. Finally. Finally. The waiting was over. Finally, he could go back to being alive. The thing about joining the war in 1914 is that nobody really knew what they were getting into. People thought it would be over by Christmas. Soldiers thought they'd have a quick adventure and be home by the holidays, telling stories about the glory of combat and the nobility of serving your country. Adrian knew better. He'd already fought a war. He knew that nobody died gloriously. Nobody died in a way that made it worth it. People just died. They died wet and cold and scared and in pain. And when you added enough of them together, when enough people died, you got atrocity. You got history. You got something that would be studied in classrooms for decades afterward. The Western Front is where they sent him, France. A place that would become a graveyard for an entire generation of young men. Trench warfare. Barbed wire stretching for miles. Machine guns that could fire 800 bullets a minute. Artillery that would level entire towns. And in the middle of it all, soldiers trying to advance maybe 10 yards without getting shot to pieces. It was mechanized hell. It was the future of warfare, showing up completely unprepared for what humans would actually do with the technology of death. In May of 1915, Adrian's unit was being moved to reinforce a position near Ypres. The move was going fine until German artillery noticed them marching through a relatively open area. A German shell came down. Just one explosion. But sometimes one is all you need. The shrapnel spread out like 1,000 tiny bullets, made of metal and fire and death, and Adrian was directly in the blast radius. The shrapnel hit him in the face, hit him in the head. One piece went right through his left eye, 1 instant of bad luck. 1 meter to the left, and he survives fine. 1 meter to the right, and his head probably comes off completely. But instead, the shrapnel took his eye. His entire left eye, gone, destroyed, useless. Most soldiers would have been evacuated immediately, would have been sent to a hospital, would have been discharged, would have gone home and tried to figure out how to live as a blind man, or half-blind anyway. But Adrian wasn't most soldiers. The blood was running down his face. His vision was completely dark on one side. And he refused to leave his post. He refused to abandon his men. He kept commanding. He kept making decisions. He kept leading soldiers into combat with a gaping wound in his head and half his vision gone. It wasn't bravery exactly. It was something deeper than that. It was a complete absence of regard for his own survival. It was refusing to accept that his injury meant anything except that he had to learn to fight differently now. They finally got him to a field hospital after a few hours of him absolutely insisting that he was fine, that his men needed him more than he needed medical attention. The doctors took one look at his eye and understood that there was nothing to save. The eye was gone, dead tissue and destroyed nerve connections. What they could do was clean out the infection, make sure it didn't spread to his brain, and hope he didn't die of infection or blood poisoning or any of the 1,000 ways soldiers died from wounds that seemed minor until suddenly they weren't. They started to fit him for a glass eye. Doctors told him he'd be invalided out. The army would give him a pension. He could go home and live a quiet life, be grateful he survived at all. Most men wouldn't have made it this far. Adrian threw the glass eye out a taxi window. I'm not making that up. He literally threw it into the street in London because he hated the way it looked, and the way it felt, and the way people stared at him when they noticed it. Instead, he got a black patch. A simple, elegant black patch that he could wear over the empty socket. And that patch became his signature. That became the thing people would remember about Adrian Carton de Wiart. Not his heroism, not his medals, not his rank. That black patch over his missing eye. Because there was something about that image that made people understand immediately. This man had paid a price for what he believed in. This man had actually sacrificed something. Within a few months, the medical board reviewed his case. And against every reasonable recommendation, against the advice of basically every doctor who examined him, they cleared him to return to active duty. He was 35 years old with one eye. He should have been finished, should have been sent to some administrative role where he could push papers and stay alive. Instead, he went back to the Western Front, back to the trenches, back to the artillery and the machine guns and the absolute insanity of trench warfare. And he went back because he asked to go back. He fought to be allowed to go back. He made it clear that he didn't want a desk job. He wanted to be where the fighting was. In April of 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, Adrian was commanding his unit again. They were in a trench. German artillery was pounding their position. And then it happened again. Another shell. Another piece of shrapnel. This time, it hit his left arm. Hit him high, near the shoulder and upper arm. His arm was hanging by pieces of skin and muscle and damaged bone. The damage was catastrophic. A proper doctor would have looked at that and said, amputation. We need to remove this now before infection sets in. The arm is destroyed. We need to cut it off to save his life. But Adrian was alone in that moment with a field surgeon who didn't have time for the proper procedures. And Adrian made a choice. Before the surgeon could even get the full extent of the damage, before they could get him to a proper surgical theater, Adrian just ripped it. His fingers were barely connected anyway. Most of the muscle was destroyed. He literally tore his own arm off rather than wait for it to be properly amputated. The pain must have been absolutely unimaginable. It's not like movies. Your body doesn't go into shock when you do something that extreme to yourself. You feel everything, every nerve screaming, every piece of damaged tissue burning. And Adrian de Wiart did that to himself because waiting for the formal amputation seemed like too much of a delay. They got him to a hospital, and the surgeons cleaned up what was left. They removed the rest of his arm, amputated it properly above the elbow. Adrian survived. He lived. And then, and I need you to really let this sink in, and then he went back to fighting. He came back to the Western Front with one eye and no left arm, and he kept commanding soldiers. He kept making decisions. He kept being a soldier. He kept choosing to be in the worst places on Earth because that was the only place where he felt like anything made sense. By July of 1916, Adrian Carton de Wiart had earned himself a reputation. Officers knew his name. Soldiers knew his name. He was the guy with the black patch and the missing arm who somehow made you believe that you could survive impossible things just by walking into a trench next to him. When the Somme offensive started, the single worst day in military history, the day that over 60,000 British soldiers died in just the first 24 hours, the High Command needed someone to take command of a battalion that had lost all its senior officers. They chose Adrian de Wiart, a one-eyed, one-armed officer who had no business being alive, let alone leading men into one of the most horrific battles in human history. They chose him because they understood that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and going anyway. And Adrian had transcended fear so completely that he wasn't even in that category anymore. He was something else entirely. This is where the story gets really interesting, because what happens next is going to tell us everything we need to know about who Adrian Carton de Wiart actually was as a human being. This is the moment where he stops being just another soldier and starts becoming something that historians would still be talking about over 100 years later. This is the moment where he does something so extraordinary that it gets him one of the highest military honors in the entire British Empire. And it gets him that honor not because of luck, not because of being in the right place at the right time, but because of a conscious choice he made to do something that no reasonable person would ever do. I need to know what you're thinking right now. I need you to imagine yourself in that trench. Picture it. You're covered in mud. Your friends are dying around you. You can hear machine gun fire. You can smell death, real death. The smell of burnt flesh and gunpowder and fear. And then your commanding officer, a man with one eye and one arm, stands up in that trench, stands up in an active battlefield, where standing up means getting shot. And he says something to you. Something so simple and so powerful that somehow you find the courage to do the impossible thing he's asking you to do. That's what happens next. That's the story that's going to explain who Adrian Carton de Wiart was, and why, even after 100 years, people still tell his story. The village is called La Boisselle. It's in northern France. On the map, it looks like nothing, just a small settlement, probably a few hundred people living there before the war started. But by the time Adrian Carton de Wiart gets there in July of 1916, La Boisselle is one of the most heavily fortified German positions on the entire Western Front. The Germans have had months to dig in. They've got trenches within trenches. They've got machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. They've got barbed wire stretched so thick that crossing it without protection means getting shredded like paper. And they're expecting reinforcements. They're expecting a British offensive. They're ready. Adrian shows up with what's left of his battalion, started with over 1,000 men a few days earlier. After the initial bombardment and the failed assaults, he's got maybe 300 soldiers left who can still fight. 300. Against a fortified German position held by soldiers who are well-rested, well-supplied, and absolutely confident they can hold this line indefinitely. The thing is, Adrian doesn't have time to be depressed about those odds. He doesn't have time to calculate the probability of success or failure. He's got a job. Take La Boisselle. That's the order. So he's going to do it. Here's where it gets crazy. There's no radio communication. There's no way to send messages back and forth between his different units. In modern warfare, that would be seen as impossible. You can't coordinate a complex military operation without communication. But Adrian figures out what he's going to do. He's going to run it himself. He's literally going to sprint back and forth between the 3 different sections of his battalion, carrying orders verbally, making sure every section knows what's happening, coordinating the whole thing on foot. Through no man's land, while bullets are flying, while artillery is landing around him. This is a man with one eye and one arm deciding that the best way to keep his men coordinated is to physically be everywhere at once. So that's what he does. He stands up in that trench, he looks at the men around him, and he says something simple. "Follow me, men." That's it. Not a long speech, not some rousing declaration about king and country, just 4 words. "Follow me, men." And they follow. They climb out of the trench. They sprint across no man's land. Machine gun fire cuts through them like scissors through paper. Men are screaming. Men are falling. Men are dying. And the survivors just keep going because Adrian is ahead of them. A man with one eye and no left arm is running toward heavily fortified German positions, and somehow that makes them believe it can be done. The assault happens over the course of a few hours. There's hand-to-hand combat. There's desperate fighting in trenches and fortified positions. There's the absolute chaos that happens when thousands of young men are trying to kill each other in confined spaces. But the British push forward. They keep moving. They overcome the German positions through sheer force of will, and the kind of courage that can only come from following someone who obviously doesn't care if he lives or dies. And eventually, after hours of fighting, after losing hundreds more men, they take La Boisselle. They take the position. They hold it. The operation is a success. Adrian is covered in blood that isn't all his own. He's exhausted in a way that goes beyond physical tiredness. He spent hours making decisions that sent men to their deaths. He's watched people he knew die on the field. He's seen what combat really looks like when you get this close to it. And when it's over, when the fighting finally stops, when his men are dug in and holding the position and the German counterattacks haven't come, Adrian sits down for maybe the first time in 18 hours. And he just breathes. That's all he does. He breathes. Command hears about what happened at La Boisselle. Higher command hears about what happened. The story spreads. A one-eyed, one-armed officer led a successful assault on a heavily fortified position by sheer force of personality and willingness to die. It's the kind of story that gets noticed. It's the kind of story that gets reported up through the chain of command to London, to the War Office, to the people who hand out the highest military honors in the British Empire. Within a few weeks, Adrian receives notification that he's been awarded the Victoria Cross. The Victoria Cross is not some ribbon they give out to hundreds of soldiers. When you win the Victoria Cross, you've done something that the entire military system recognizes as extraordinary. You've gone beyond normal bravery. You've done something that history will remember. It's the highest honor a soldier can receive. It's the military equivalent of being told that your country recognizes you as one of its greatest warriors. So there's a ceremony, there's a formal presentation, and Adrian gets to meet the king, George V, the reigning British monarch. And the king, this is according to historical records, the king asks Adrian about his experience in the war, asks him what it was like, asks him to reflect on everything that's happened, asks him to express some sense of gratitude for having survived, for having been recognized. And Adrian, standing there with one eye and one arm, in the presence of his monarch, looks at the king and says, "Frankly, Your Majesty, I enjoyed the war." There's a moment of absolute silence in the room. The courtiers don't know how to react. The generals surrounding the king are suddenly very interested in their shoes. The king himself just stares at Adrian for a moment. Because nobody says that. Nobody looks at their monarch and tells him that they enjoyed something that killed hundreds of thousands of people. Nobody admits that war was fun for them. It violates every social norm. It violates every expectation of how a decorated soldier should behave. But Adrian doesn't care about those expectations. Adrian never did. He answers honestly. He tells the truth about how he feels. And the thing is, you can't actually punish someone for telling the truth to the king in front of witnesses. So nothing happens. The king doesn't have him thrown in prison. Nobody courts-martials him. Instead, the story gets whispered about. Officers talk about it. Other soldiers hear about this one-eyed officer who told the king he enjoyed the war. And somehow, that story makes Adrian even more of a legend than the Victoria Cross did. Because people understand that he's not pretending. He's not performing bravery. He's not acting out some role that society has decided soldiers should play. He's being completely, brutally honest about who he is and what he feels. After the Victoria Cross, after the medal ceremony with the king, Adrian goes back to fighting. The war doesn't end just because he's been honored. He keeps commanding. He keeps leading men into combat. He keeps doing the same thing over and over again because stopping doesn't make sense to him. The war is still happening. His men still need him. So he keeps going. The First World War eventually ends in 1918. 4 years of absolute slaughter finally come to a conclusion. Millions of men are dead. Entire generations of young men from Europe are gone. Families are destroyed. Countries are bankrupted. And for what? Nobody can even really explain what the war was supposed to accomplish. It was supposedly the war to end all wars, but it wasn't. It was just the first chapter of a longer story. Adrian comes home. He's been wounded multiple times. He's got that black eye patch. He's got the missing arm. He's got a whole chest full of medals. But he comes home to a country that wants to pretend the war didn't happen. People want to move on. They want to put the horror behind them. They want to forget about the trenches and the machine guns and the bodies stacked like firewood. They want to go back to normal life as quickly as possible. And Adrian realizes something. There is no normal life for him anymore. He can't go back to being a lawyer. He can't go back to the kind of civilian existence that most people have. He tries. He really does. He tries to be a normal person. He gets a job. He does normal things. But inside he's screaming. Inside he's dying, because he's not alive anymore. He's just existing. He's breathing and eating and sleeping, but he's not actually living. He finds an outlet. He starts hunting. Big game hunting. Dangerous hunting. He goes to Africa, to South America, to places where you can track down lions and tigers and elephants and other animals that can kill you just as easily as you can kill them. And when he's hunting, when he's out there in the wilderness with a rifle in his one good hand and a tracker behind him and predators all around him, he feels alive again. That's the only time he feels like he's actually present in his own life. That's the only time nothing else matters except the immediate moment and whether he's going to survive the next few hours. People ask him how he hunts with one arm. How does he load the rifle? How does he take the shot? How does he track animals and move through dense jungle and do all the things that hunting requires when you're physically missing a limb? And Adrian just smiles that dangerous smile of his and tells them he learned. That's it. That's the whole explanation. He learned because he had to. Because giving up and accepting his limitations was never an option. Because the disability wasn't actually his problem. His problem was that he was bored without danger. But hunting, as intense as it is, doesn't replace war. It gets close. It scratches the itch. But it's not the same. It's not organized violence on a massive scale. It's not the stakes that come with commanding men in combat. It's not the same kind of adrenaline. It's not the same kind of meaning. Adrian knows this. He feels it. He's waiting for something. He doesn't know what, but he's waiting. In 1939, the world confirms that Adrian's waiting was justified. Adolf Hitler invades Poland. World War II starts. And Adrian, who is now in his late 50s, who is considered a decorated veteran of the previous war, who should probably be retired and living comfortably somewhere, immediately volunteers. He wants back in. He wants to be part of this next war. He wants to fight again. The military, recognizing that they have a living legend who actually wants to serve, puts him back in uniform. But this time it's different. This time, Adrian is too old to be on the front lines commanding troops directly, so they send him to North Africa. They make him a liaison officer. His job is to coordinate between different military units and operations. It's administrative work mostly. It's important, sure, but it's not combat. It's not the thing that makes him feel alive. He hates it. He tolerates it, but he hates it. In early 1941, flying back from a military operation, his transport plane is attacked by German fighters. The plane is shot up. The engines are on fire. The pilot turns to Adrian and says that they're not going to make it. The plane is going down. That's it. That's the end. Adrian has survived everything. He's survived wounds that should have killed him. He's survived diseases and infections, and bullet fire and artillery, and everything else that war could throw at him. And now he's going to die in a burning airplane, because there's no way out. There's no fighting this. There's no way to overcome this with willpower and determination. And then Adrian does something completely unexpected. He ejects. He bails out of the plane with a parachute. The parachute opens. He's descending toward the ground. And as he's floating there above North Africa, drifting down toward the earth, he realizes something. He's not descending toward friendly territory. He's descending toward German-held territory. He's parachuting directly into enemy lines. He's landed in the middle of German positions. He's captured almost immediately. He's a prisoner of war. For the first time since he was a young man joining the Boer War, Adrian is trapped. He's in a cage, literally in a military prison camp. He can't leave. He can't fight. He can't do anything except sit and exist. And existence, for Adrian Carton de Wiart, is the closest thing to death. It's torture. It's absolute horror, being kept alive but unable to act, unable to do anything that makes life feel meaningful. It's worse than the gunfire. It's worse than the infections. It's worse than the wounds. Being trapped is the worst thing that could possibly happen to him. But Adrian can't accept that. He can't accept being a prisoner. So he tries to escape. Multiple times. He's caught multiple times. Each time they catch him, the Germans know exactly who he is. They know he's the Victoria Cross winner. They know he's a legendary British officer. They know that killing him would be a propaganda disaster. So they don't kill him. But they also don't let him go. They keep him locked up. They move him around. They're trying to figure out what to do with this one-eyed, one-armed British officer who keeps trying to escape from every camp they put him in. Eventually, they transfer him to an Italian prison camp. Italy is technically allied with Germany, so theoretically, he should be more secure there. But Adrian doesn't care about politics or alliances or any of that stuff. All he knows is that he's imprisoned, and every moment he spends imprisoned is a moment he's not living. So he plans another escape. He and some other British prisoners figure out a route. They think they can break through the fence, make it across open terrain, and reach neutral Switzerland. It's a long shot. The odds are terrible. But Adrian doesn't care about odds anymore. They make their break. They cut through the fence. They start moving across open ground toward the Swiss border. Adrian's running, which is an accomplishment in itself because he's in his 60s and he's only got one arm and one eye. But he's running because running is what you do when you're trying to escape. He almost makes it. He's close to the border. He's close to freedom. He's close to getting out. And then the Italian guards catch up with him. They grab him. They bring him back. Another failed escape. Another punishment. Another round of being locked up. By this point in the war, Adrian is genuinely thinking about the possibility that he might actually die in a prison camp. That this is how it's going to end. Not in combat, not doing something that feels meaningful, but locked up in a cage somewhere in Europe, a prisoner of war that nobody's really paying attention to anymore. It's a depressing thought. It's a thought that would break most people. But it doesn't break Adrian because he's already transcended that kind of thinking. He's already accepted that death is coming anyway. So, what difference does it make if it comes in a prison camp or on a battlefield? At least in a prison camp, he doesn't have to pretend to be afraid. Then, something changes. The Italians surrender to the Allies. Suddenly, the prison camp is in chaos. Nobody knows who's in charge. Nobody knows what the rules are anymore. The guards are confused. Some of them just abandon their posts. Adrian sees an opportunity. He sees people running in different directions. He sees confusion. And in the middle of that confusion, he escapes again. This time, it actually works. He manages to get out of the camp and get to a location where Allied forces can reach him. He's been a prisoner of war for months, and now he's free. But before he can even process what's happened, before he can even get back to fighting, the military decides they're going to fly him home. They put him on a transport plane. They want to get him back to Britain so that he can receive medical care and possibly be discharged. Adrian doesn't want to go home. Adrian doesn't want to be discharged. But it's not really his choice. He's on a plane. It's going to take him back to England. And then his war is going to be over. Except it's not. Because the plane crashes. The second transport plane he's ever been on crashes. This time, he's not shot down. This time, it's just an accident. A mechanical failure. Bad luck. The plane goes down. Multiple people die. Adrian survives. He survives with a broken spine, broken ribs, multiple fractures. The kind of injuries that would usually mean the end of a military career for anyone else. But for Adrian, it's just another thing to overcome. The doctors tell him he needs to rest. He needs to heal. He needs to accept that he's done everything he can, and it's time to let other people carry the fight. And Adrian listens to them. He knows his body is failing. He knows he's getting older. He knows that his injuries are piling up in a way that even his extraordinary willpower can't overcome forever. So he doesn't go back to the front lines. He doesn't try to get back into combat. Instead, they send him to be a military attaché, a diplomat, someone who represents British interests to allied countries and coordinates political and military affairs at a high level. And that's when Adrian discovers something unexpected. Diplomacy is also a form of combat. It's not combat in the traditional sense. There's no bullets, there's no blood. But there's strategy, there's psychology, there's understanding what your opponent needs and using that to get what you need. There's negotiation and leverage and all the things that make warfare complicated and interesting. And Adrian turns out to be extraordinarily good at diplomacy. But before we get to that part of the story, there's something else we need to understand about Adrian Carton de Wiart. There's a question that historians have been asking for 100 years now. How does a human being survive what Adrian survived? How does someone lose an eye and an arm and continue fighting? How does someone endure imprisonment and torture and injuries that would normally be fatal or permanently disabling? The answer isn't that he had superhuman luck. The answer isn't that he had magical healing powers. The answer is something much more interesting and much more disturbing. The question we need to answer is this: why was Adrian Carton de Wiart different? What made him capable of doing things that would destroy a normal person? And the answer isn't that he had more courage than other people. Courage is about being afraid and doing something anyway. Adrian wasn't afraid. That's the key difference. Adrian's brain was wired in a way that most human brains aren't. He had something that researchers would eventually call an aberrant fear response, which is a fancy way of saying that the part of his brain that was supposed to produce fear, that was supposed to make him cautious and protective of his own survival, didn't work the way it's supposed to work in most people. When normal people see danger, their amygdala lights up. That's the part of the brain that detects threats and triggers the fight or flight response. It releases cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate goes up, your pupils dilate. You become hyper-aware of the danger around you. It's a survival mechanism. It's supposed to keep you alive. But Adrian's amygdala apparently wasn't producing these signals the way it should have been. When he saw danger, his brain didn't scream warnings at him. His brain didn't beg him to run away. His brain just kind of acknowledged that danger existed and moved on. He was aware of threats intellectually, but he wasn't emotionally disturbed by them. This is rare. This is genuinely rare. Maybe one in a few thousand people have this kind of neurological configuration. Most people who have it end up being criminals or psychopaths, because without the emotional weight of fear or empathy, it's easy to hurt people and not feel bad about it. But Adrian wasn't a criminal. Adrian wasn't a psychopath. He actually had normal levels of empathy. He cared about other people. He cared deeply about his soldiers. He made decisions that tried to minimize casualties among his own men. But he just didn't care about his own survival. His empathy didn't extend to himself. So when he was standing in a trench and his instincts told him to take cover, when normal self-preservation would suggest hiding from bullets, Adrian instead stood up in full view of enemy positions and gave orders. When a rational person would say, "I should probably go to a hospital for this life-threatening wound," Adrian instead said, "Let me tear off my own arm so I can get back to fighting." When a normal person would have been devastated by losing an eye and an arm, Adrian was already figuring out how to adapt and keep going. This isn't superhuman. It's not magic. It's just a broken fear response, combined with above-average intelligence, and a certain kind of personality that actually enjoys risk and complexity. Add those things together, and you get someone like Adrian Carton de Wiart. Someone who is basically terrifying to be around, because he makes you question everything you believe about human limitations. Because if Adrian can do all these things with one eye and one arm, what are you doing with two of both? What's your excuse? Why are you limiting yourself with fear when Adrian has already proven that fear is optional? That's the real power of Adrian's story. It's not that he did impossible things. It's that he proved that many of the things we think are impossible are actually just limited by our own fear. We tell ourselves we can't do something, but really we just don't want to deal with the consequences if we fail. We don't want to feel the fear. Adrian didn't have that option. He had to face his own brain every morning and accept that fear wasn't going to protect him, so he might as well do whatever he actually wanted to do. In 1945, with the Second World War coming to an end, Adrian is still alive, still functioning, still capable. And Winston Churchill, who knows Adrian's reputation, decides to use him in a diplomatic capacity. Churchill sends Adrian to Poland as a military liaison. His job is to maintain relationships with Polish military forces and coordinate operations between British and Polish armies. It's important work, but it's also extremely political. Poland is falling under Soviet influence. The Allies are uncertain about what's going to happen after the war ends. There's a possibility of another conflict starting immediately, this time between the Soviet Union and the Western powers. Churchill needs someone who understands military operations and can also navigate complicated political situations. Adrian goes to Poland. He's in his mid-60s now. He spent the better part of 50 years in military service. He's been wounded more times than most people get wounded in their entire lives. He's missing an eye and an arm, and he's still working, still contributing, still doing his job. Because retirement, for Adrian, would be worse than any battlefield. Sitting at home doing nothing would kill him faster than any bullet. What's interesting about Adrian in Poland is that his disabilities actually become an asset. He walks into rooms with his black eye patch and his empty sleeve, and people see him as a symbol of British sacrifice. They see him as someone who has actually paid a price for his country. They see him as someone who understands the cost of war because he's literally carrying the scars of war on his body. Polish military leaders respect him, not despite his injuries, but because of them. His disabilities become proof that he's not just talking about sacrifice, he's actually lived it. After Poland, Churchill sends him to China as a military attaché. China is a complicated mess at this point in history. The Japanese occupation is ending, but there's civil war brewing between the nationalist government and the communist forces. Again, Adrian's job is to coordinate military affairs and maintain British interests in a country that's heading toward massive political upheaval. He's dealing with Chinese warlords and military commanders and politicians who are all trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And Adrian, this one-eyed, one-armed British officer, somehow manages to maintain relationships and gather intelligence and do the job that Churchill has asked him to do. By the time Adrian finally retires from active military service, he's done more than most generals do in a lifetime. He's commanded troops in 3 wars. He's been wounded more than a dozen times. He's been a prisoner of war. He's survived plane crashes. He's led successful military operations. He's coordinated between different nations and military forces. He's been awarded the Victoria Cross. He's been knighted. He's been promoted to the rank of lieutenant general. He's done everything, and he's still alive. In 1960, when Adrian is 80 years old, he finally decides it's time to write his story. He's been approached by publishers and journalists and historians who all want to know what it was like to be Adrian Carton de Wiart, what it was like to survive what he survived, what it was like to live through 3 wars and come out the other side still standing. Adrian decides to write his autobiography. He calls it Happy Odyssey, not Tragic Odyssey, not Surviving Against All Odds Odyssey, just Happy Odyssey, because that's how Adrian sees his life, as a happy thing, as a good thing, as something worth writing down. When you read Adrian's memoir, when you actually get his words about what he experienced, you start to understand how different his perspective is from most people's. Most soldiers, when they write about war, they write about the horror. They write about trauma. They write about the things that haunt them. Adrian writes about the things that made him feel alive. He describes combat with a kind of wistfulness, like he's nostalgic for it. He describes his injuries almost like they're interesting challenges to overcome rather than terrible things that happened to him. He describes his imprisonment with frustration about not being able to act rather than terror about being trapped. One quote from Happy Odyssey stands out above all the others. It's become one of the most famous things Adrian ever said. He writes, "Life is a gift. Even with one eye and no hand, life was the greatest gift I ever received." He wrote that at 80 years old, after living through everything he'd lived through. After losing pieces of himself literally and figuratively, after being imprisoned and tortured and shot at and bombed, after watching people he cared about die. And his conclusion was that life was a gift, that it was worth it, that he wouldn't change anything. There's another quote from his memoir that's equally revealing. When people ask him what he thought about during all those years of warfare, he says, "Frankly, I have enjoyed war." He says it again, decades later, when he's writing about his life. It's not a one-time comment made to the king. It's his actual philosophy. He spent his entire adult life in conflict because he genuinely enjoyed it. He enjoyed the clarity of it. He enjoyed the purpose. He enjoyed the risk. He enjoyed the feeling of being necessary and important. Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid conflict and seeking comfort and safety. Adrian spent his entire life doing the exact opposite. But here's the thing that's important to understand. Adrian wasn't a warmonger. He wasn't someone who wanted conflict just for the sake of conflict. He wasn't trying to start wars or create problems. He was responding to wars that were already happening. He was solving problems that society had created. He was serving a function. And he was good at that function, but he also wasn't apologizing for enjoying what he was doing. He wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He wasn't performing the role of the reluctant soldier. He was just being honest about who he was and what motivated him. In 1963, Adrian Carton de Wiart dies. He's 83 years old. He's lived through more history than most historians study. He's lived through the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, and the beginning of the Cold War. He's lived through the transition from horse cavalry to mechanized warfare. He's lived through technology-changing warfare completely. And he's adapted to all of it. He's survived all of it. And then one day, his heart just stops. He dies in his sleep, peacefully, without drama. Which is kind of the perfect ending for someone who lived such a dramatic life. Anticlimactic, quiet, simple. After Adrian's death, something unexpected happens. His story doesn't fade away. Instead, it grows. More and more people discover his memoir. More and more historians study his military record. More and more soldiers and veterans and people who are struggling with their own disabilities read about Adrian Carton de Wiart and realize something important. If Adrian could do what he did with one eye and one arm, then maybe they can figure out a way to do what they want to do with whatever they have. People who lost limbs in combat read Adrian's story and stop thinking of themselves as disabled and start thinking of themselves as challenged. People who faced setbacks and failures and thought they were finished read Adrian's story and realize that finishing was optional. People who were afraid of taking risks, afraid of failure, afraid of pain, afraid of being uncomfortable, read Adrian's story and for the first time questioned whether their fear was actually protecting them or just limiting them. The Victoria Cross that Adrian won has been displayed in various military museums. His medals are studied by military historians. His memoir has been reprinted multiple times. His name appears in books about military leadership and books about overcoming adversity. Films have been made about his life. Documentaries have been produced. He's become one of those rare historical figures who is actually studied not just for what he accomplished, but for who he was as a person. Because Adrian Carton de Wiart represents something that most people never get to experience. He represents a human being who was completely free from the constraints that limit most of us. Most of our limitations in life aren't actually physical. They're not about our circumstances. They're about our mindset. They're about the stories we tell ourselves about what's possible and what's impossible. We tell ourselves we can't do something, and then we don't do it. We tell ourselves that we're not strong enough or brave enough or smart enough, and then we accept that story as truth. Adrian never did that. Adrian looked at a situation and just did what needed to be done. If he needed a left arm to accomplish something, and he didn't have a left arm, he figured out how to do it with his right arm or his teeth or whatever else was available. He didn't spend time mourning what he didn't have. He used what he had and moved forward. That's the real lesson from Adrian Carton de Wiart's life. It's not that you need to be fearless to accomplish great things. It's not that you need to be physically perfect or genetically blessed or born into the right circumstances. The lesson is that your limitations are often optional. The constraints on your life are often self-imposed. The things you think are impossible are often just things that are inconvenient. And the difference between people who accomplish extraordinary things and people who don't often comes down to something very simple. The people who do it don't accept the stories that tell them they can't. Adrian Carton de Wiart lived through the worst things human beings can experience, and came out the other side not just surviving, but actually grateful to have lived through it. He was grateful to be alive. He was grateful for his experiences. He was grateful for the challenges and the pain and the loss, because they made his life feel meaningful. And that gratitude, that ability to find meaning and purpose in things that would destroy most people, that's what actually made him great. That's what made him a legend. That's what made his story worth telling 100 years after he lived it. But here's where I need to ask you something, because this is where Adrian's story connects to your life. Because you're watching this right now, probably from home, probably in comfort, probably without anyone shooting at you or bombs falling around you or anyone trying to kill you. You have both eyes. You have both arms. You have advantages that Adrian didn't have. You have safety. You have security. You have time and resources and opportunities. And the question Adrian's life raises is this: what are you doing with all of that? What are you not doing because you're afraid? What are you not attempting because it might be uncomfortable? What are you not pursuing because you've decided it's impossible before you've even tried? Adrian spent his entire life saying yes to things that terrified normal people. Adrian spent his entire life moving toward danger instead of away from it. Adrian spent his entire life doing things that seemed impossible because he just decided that whether it was possible or impossible didn't matter as much as whether it was necessary. He did what was necessary. He did what was in front of him. He did what needed to be done. You might not need to fight in a war. You might not need to lose an eye or an arm or survive a plane crash. But you do have something in your life that you're avoiding. You do have something that's calling to you, that you're telling yourself you can't do. You do have a part of yourself that wants to push further, want to be braver, want to accomplish something that scares you. And every time you don't do that thing, every time you listen to your fear instead of your purpose, you're choosing comfort over meaning. You're choosing safety over aliveness. Adrian's last years were spent in retirement, which meant he spent them suffering. Because retirement, for someone like Adrian, wasn't a gift. It was a punishment. He had to learn how to live in a world where there was no purpose, no mission, no danger to overcome. He had to sit around and remember what it was like to be alive when he was younger and the war was still happening. That's not how you want to spend your final years. You don't want to get to the end of your life and realize that you spent it being safe and comfortable, but never actually being alive. So, what's the question you need to ask yourself right now? What's the thing you've been avoiding? What's the fear that's holding you back? What's the story you've been telling yourself about why you can't do something? Because Adrian Carton de Wiart proved that the story is usually wrong. He proved that you're more capable than you think. He proved that your limitations are often just limitations you've accepted because they're convenient. There's something else about Adrian's story that's worth thinking about. At the end of his life, when people asked him if he regretted anything, if he would do anything differently, if he could go back and start over, Adrian said no. He said he wouldn't change anything. Even knowing what he knew about the pain and the loss and the suffering, he still wouldn't change anything because it was all part of the same story. It was all part of the same journey. It was all part of what made him who he was. And Adrian liked who he was. He was comfortable with himself. He was proud of who he'd become. He was satisfied with his life. Can you say the same thing about your life? Can you say that you wouldn't change anything? Can you say that you're satisfied with the choices you've made and the person you've become? Or are you going to get to the end of your life and realize that you spent it playing small, staying safe, avoiding risk, and never actually pushing yourself to see what you were capable of? That's the real question that Adrian's story raises. It's not about fighting in wars, or losing body parts, or surviving impossible situations. It's about whether you're going to live your life on your terms, or whether you're going to let fear and comfort and convenience make all the decisions for you. Adrian Carton de Wiart was 83 when he died. He had one eye and one arm. He had been shot and bombed and imprisoned and tortured and broken and fixed and broken again. And he died satisfied with his life. He died believing that life was a gift. He died knowing that he had actually lived instead of just existing. He died having pushed himself to the limits of what humans can endure, and having discovered that those limits are much further away than most people think. The question now is, what you're going to do with this information. Because you know his story. You know what he was capable of. You know that someone can live through unimaginable suffering and come out the other side grateful. You know that fear is often optional. You know that your limitations might not be as fixed as you think they are. So what are you going to do differently? What's going to change in your life because you watch this story? That's the real open-loop ending to Adrian Carton de Wiart's story. It's not about what happened to him. It's about what happens to you next. It's about whether you're going to let his example be just an interesting story that you forgot about 5 minutes after the video ends, or whether it's going to actually change how you think about your own life and your own potential. And the only way to find out is to go out and actually do something that scares you. Go out and actually try something that you've been avoiding. Go out and actually push yourself to be more than you thought you were capable of being. Leave a comment down below and tell me, what's the thing you've been avoiding? What's the fear that's been holding you back? Because Adrian's story isn't just about him. It's about all of us. It's about what human beings are actually capable of when we stop letting fear run our lives. And maybe, just maybe, someone reading your comment is going to see themselves in your struggle and realize that they're not alone. That they're not the only one who's afraid. That they're not the only one who's been avoiding something they know they should do. And if this video helped you understand something about yourself, if Adrian's story actually changed your perspective on your own limitations, then hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories like this. There are more examples of human beings who pushed themselves beyond what they thought was possible. There are more examples of people who chose meaning over comfort, who chose challenge over safety, who chose to actually be alive instead of just existing. And if you want to see more of those stories, if you want to be reminded again and again that you're more capable than you think, then subscribe. Join the community of people who are refusing to accept their limitations. Join the community of people who are choosing to live instead of just exist. Adrian Carton de Wiart is gone now. He died over 60 years ago. But his legacy is alive in everyone who's ever read his story and decided that they were going to do something different with their life. His legacy is alive in every person who's ever said yes to something that terrified them. His legacy is alive in every person who's ever realized that their limitations were just limitations they'd accepted, and they decided to push past them anyway. That's how humans actually change. That's how we actually grow, not by staying safe. but by doing exactly what Adrian did, by walking forward into the fear and figuring out how to survive on the other side. Because if Adrian could survive everything he survived, then what excuse do any of us have for not pushing ourselves?